Dr Megan Woods.
Mr Chairman, and I'm very happy to take a call at this committee stage talking about part one of the legislation. Of course, this being the enabling legislation for the Great State House sell-off that we're seeing here today, wrapped up in ideological rhetoric of flexibility. And what we've had is the Minister, because none of the members opposite are willing to stand up and defend what is a terrible policy and a terrible piece of legislation, try and justify about how this really is doing right by the tenants. But if we look at what part one actually does, Mr Chairman, we heard the Minister wax lyrical, but I'd ask the Minister to take another call and point us to the provisions in the legislation that we're here in this House debating. Point me to the clause that does what it is that the Minister claims that this legislation is going to do. Because, Mr Chairman, he can't, because this legislation does none of that. While the government can purport that this is all about flexibility, Mr Chairman, this is about selling off state houses. We have not heard about how one more piece of social housing is going to be provided in this House. My colleague Phil Goff just finished off his speech asking that question. I too would like to put that question to members opposite. Tell me how this bill provides for more social housing in New Zealand. Tell me how more houses are going to be provided for the people who are currently struggling to find accommodation in this country. Tell me how one more person is going to get off the Housing New Zealand waiting list. But more importantly, tell me how one more person is going to get onto the Housing New Zealand waiting list. In the last quarter, 4,000 of the 6,000 people who applied to go on the waiting list, not to get a house, but who applied to go on the waiting list for a Housing New Zealand house, didn't make it. And this legislation will do nothing to help those people. My colleague said that he imagined that members opposite were having to sleep with their spray misters and their couple of Hayek. Well, they're also cuddling up to their fluffy toy version of the big society, because this is what they're trying to do in this legislation. But like experiments in other places in the world, it's not working. We have the social service agencies lining up and saying that this isn't going to work, that they cannot see how the government's plans to sell off state houses will in any way benefit tenants. They're saying that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the infrastructure to manage a sizable housing stock of which the government is imagining. So what are we left with? Who is the government going to sell to? Surprise, surprise, it's going to be developers. It's what they always intended anyway, wrapped up under the guise of housing NGOs who have told them they don't want a bar of it. And Mr Chairman, that is why we are debating this legislation under urgency, so those NGOs don't get a chance to come to Select Committee and tell the government how they don't want their offer. What they don't want is their private property developer mates coming to Select Committee and saying they're lining up to buy these houses. Are they lining up to buy these houses because they want to provide wraparound services that provide well for some of the most vulnerable in our country? No, Mr Chairman, they're lining up to buy these houses because they see a chance to make a profit, because that's what the private sector does. And the reason why these need to stay in public ownership is because we have decided in this country that the government should intervene. The government has a responsibility to ensure that we do have housing as a crucial and critical part of our welfare safety net, that when people need it, that it is there, that we do not have families that simply cannot find a place to live. Many of us have spoken about the challenges that the people in our electorates are facing, what we are seeing on the ground at the coalface every day and every week. And I can only guess that members opposite do this as well, that the job of a constituency MP is increasingly being taken up in housing issues, that increasingly housing is forming a major part of our workload, and it's people who simply cannot find somewhere somewhere to live, who cannot get onto the waiting list, who cannot deal with Housing New Zealand when they're there. I'd like to use a couple of examples from my electorate. One is a woman in her 60s who cannot afford to be in the private rental market in Christchurch. Mr. Chairman.
Clayton Mitchell.